Well, hello and welcome to this short video where I'm going to talk a little bit about chapter 5, the discussion. I will give you some suggestions on how to write it. And before I go into details, let's kind of rewrap that the idea of this chapter 5 is that you need to contrast what previous studies assumed will happen in the topic that you're studying versus what you found in your actual data. So basically, it's like overlapping chapter 2, the literature review, with the chapter 4, the findings. You want to contrast what is there versus what it is here. There is a lecture on this topic in, I think it's lecture 5, the theorizing. So I think you can take a look at more details on how to do this. Um, Also, I think like something important or something useful from this video is that I can give you a structure that you can follow, but also you can be a little bit creative. Like you don't have to follow this structure like extremely as detailed as I'm doing it. You can have some flexibility, but on the other hand, I think that this structure helps. I think you can cover every aspect, especially with this methodology that we're using quant and qual. I think maybe this structure is useful, so it's a good idea if you follow, but it's not the end of the world if you don't do it like I do. But so keeping in mind this thing that I mentioned at the beginning, that this chapter is about overlapping what previous studies assume that will happen versus what actually happened, chapter 2 versus chapter 4. Let's talk a little bit about this chapter 5. So in this structure that I am suggesting, I I think it's a good idea if you start with the quantitative part. So kind of overlapping your findings from the quant part versus previous studies. So I think there are three possibilities of what happened in your quant findings. One possibility is that you fully support your hypothesis, or at least you support your hypothesis. Uh, and that means that what you thought will happen, that what the literature suggests that will happen, actually happened. So you set a hypothesis, financial stress will influence happiness negatively, or something like that. That will be your hypothesis. And you support that. You say, like, yes, I did the analysis, I made the numbers, and it's significant and it's negative. So I support the hypothesis. So you're basically saying that you agree with what previous studies have found. But remember that in the introduction and maybe in the literature review, you were also critical because you wanted to motivate your study. You wanted to say, yeah, we know that that relationship could be negative, but still we need to study because in this context, maybe it's different. Maybe students are experiencing something different and previous studies are not focused on students, or you try to give a twist. So use that twist from these initial chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, to not come up with a boring discussion, because a boring discussion will be like, I assume this will happen and it happened. That's very boring. It's okay if you assume that something will happen and it actually happened, but try to give an explanation, because that explanation is what uh, extends the knowledge on that topic. It's fine. It's totally fine if you support the hypothesis, but try to bring that twist. Like, what makes your findings special? What brings new to the table on this conversation on this topic? What is unique about your sample that maybe you are adding, or you can exploit and add to the discussion on that topic? Another possibility is that instead of supporting, you reject it. You reject the hypothesis and you say, we expected that this will happen, but it didn't happen. It's not like that. Either is the opposite sign or it's not significant. If that is your conclusion, then also try to give an explanation. Do not stop with it didn't work, because again, that's like, and what do we learn? Explain why or how is it that it didn't work. Try to again exploit your data, the uniqueness, the context. Like maybe explain like, oh, in that context it will have in previous studies it was a different context where it worked, but now it's different. And finally, the third possibility in this 5.1 in the quant discussion, the third possibility is that maybe instead of not support or not reject, you just have mixed findings. Like one model says support, another says reject. So you have inconclusive conclusion, inconclusive, yeah, conclusion. So if that is the case, I think the overall analysis is that the relationship that you wanted to test is more complex than what you thought. That's why you have this kind of contradictory findings or inconclusive findings. So also exploit again the context. Why maybe before we had like a more simple way of seeing things. There was less dynamic environment, and now we are experiencing something differently. That's why the conclusion is that it's inconclusive, like it's not, it's neither support or reject. So in this for 5.1, based on whatever you concluded, if it is fully support, fully reject, or partial support, partial reject, or inconclusive, whatever your conclusion is on the hypothesis, elaborate an explanation that adds knowledge to that topic. I think 1 or 2 paragraphs is enough. You don't need to write a lot. 1 or 2 is super good. Then let's move to 5.2, where my suggestion is to separate the discussion now and move towards the qualitative part. In the qualitative study, when you did your literature review, you also identify in the literature review a few concepts that were important for your topic. You have that in your literature review. Beyond the hypothesis that you said, you also have some 2 or 3, 4 concepts that are important. And in your findings in workshop 2, which we did a couple of weeks ago, we also had the same thing. We coded the transcript, we identified concepts, then themes and aggregates. So try to take a look at your aggregates and themes that you found versus the ones that you found in the literature. Are they similar, the same? And here you can also have different possibilities. Possibility number 1, maybe your aggregates, the ones that you found in the data, are similar to the ones that are in previous studies. Maybe you found that social aspects were important in the interviews and social aspects were important in the literature review. So they are similar. Say that in the discussion, but bring that twist again. Maybe the concepts are there, but maybe they behave differently in the context of your study. So maybe these themes or aggregates are similar, like social aspects are in the literature and social aspects are in your studies, but hopefully, and I'm pretty sure that in your data, they behave differently. They operate in a different way. So explain that. So you can say, yeah, we support the findings from this author because we also found that social aspects are important, but we they are conceptualized different, or they operate differently, or we bring an explanation on how they work. That is one thing that you can do. Second, another possibility is that maybe you identified some concepts, themes, or whatever in the literature, but they are very fragmented. They are very separate. Like one paper talks about sustainability, environmental sustainability. Another one talks about regulations, but they are not connected. There are some papers on regulations, other papers on sustainability strategy, and they do not connect. It's possible that could have happened. And maybe in your studies, you also found this, but maybe what you also found is the connection between them. You understand from your data how regulation affects strategy and the other way around. So discuss that. That is the second possibility, that you agree with previous studies on that some things are there, but then you can add to the conversation that you explain how they are connected. And finally, number 3, it is possible also that you found something new, something that you didn't see in the literature. So maybe you found that, I don't know, like, I don't know, virtual reality consumer behavior is very important. And you don't see that in the literature. So you can bring that. That's something that you can bring. So explain what is that? Why is that important? How it connects with other concepts from the literature that exist earlier. And in qualitative, it's very random because I mean, maybe some of you have the 3 examples I gave. You found consistency in the terms, but you also have you can explain connections, and maybe you also identified a new term. Maybe you have everything, So feel free to write a little bit more in the discussion. You can write the 3 points that you found. It's also okay. Or maybe you don't find anything new. You kind of found what was also in previous studies, but then try to explain how these concepts operate differently in your data, because I'm sure that is not perfect fit. So I think that's how you can write the discussion. In my suggestion, you can write like between 1 or 2 paragraphs is enough. Also, you don't need a lot to write in here. So 1, 2 paragraphs, 1, 2 paragraphs. And finally, the last suggestion is to include like an overall kind of contribution. If you kind of conclude from both sides, the quant and the qual, what is that you are bringing you to the table? Try to write like a kind of one single concluding paragraph where you elaborate more on that. If you combine the two things that you are discussing here, the 2 or 3 things that you're conducting here or arguing for, what is what you are actually contributing to? Are you contributing to a better understanding from a social angle or from a more psychological angle? Or are you contributing to a more contextualized interpretation of this topic? What is kind of the overall like high level contribution that you are making? And if we take a look at the group assignment, they actually did something a little bit different because they started the other way around. They started from the theoretical contribution. It's not a problem. That's what I say. You have some flexibility. And they actually spent a lot of time on arguing for this theoretical contribution. And they put a lot of their own kind of data in here. It's very empirical, like especially this section. So I think I I I will criticize a little bit this example because I think this part is not that strong. I feel it's kind of like a summary of the findings in a way. So this is something I will criticize a little bit. I don't think this section is that strong. But the next sections, 5.2 and 5.3, are actually pretty strong. In 5.2, what they did is basically this, the hypothesis conclusion. So this is the quantitative discussion. They discuss how their findings contrast with previous studies, and then they use some references in here. And the framework, they name it framework, is the qualitative discussion. And this is super good. Actually, this part is very good. I think you can use it as a guideline because they discuss in quite depth their findings versus the previous studies from the literature review, and they finish with a redesigned framework. If you go back to the literature review, they had a simple framework, and this is a improved version of that framework. So I think they did very good job in these 2 parts. I think they could have improved the theoretical contribution because by leaving it, but putting it at the beginning, I think they lost the power of the actual discussion that they made. It will have fit better at the end, and then it will be easier to kind of summarize the contribution and not the empirics, because that's what they did in here. They focus a lot on the empirics. So my suggestion from the group nice examples from previous semester is that maybe this theoretical contribution fits better at the end, and it will be like more streamlined towards theory rather than the empirics. One final suggestion or instruction, but I think it's more instruction, is that in chapter 2 you use many references from previous studies. In chapter 4 you only use quotes mostly from your data, and you use your data. But in chapter 5, you need to come back to the use of references. And sometimes I got a question like, should all references from here, like this paper, or there's another paper probably here, should all these papers be also in the literature review? And my answer is there is no right or wrong answer, but generally around 70% of the papers that you use in the discussion are also in the literature review because it's coherent, it's consistent. It doesn't have to be the 100%. You can add new references in here. You don't have to use all the references from the literature review in the discussion, but it's kind of a healthy number to use. I don't know, 70% is a good number of references coming from the literature review. So this is a quite intense section in terms of literature review, this chapter 5. And final point is that probably when you, because in this discussion, you will need to come back to the first chapters, especially introduction and literature review. And maybe you realize, okay, we need to focus a lot on this because we actually have the answer to this. That's something very normal. If you identify that, take note of that, and maybe you can rewrite it on the last week, or you can start working on it. It's totally normal and it should happen. This is something that should happen. You will need to revise a little bit the introduction and the literature review because now you know the final answer. So you need to kind of signpost the correct question and the correct problematization. So that's it for the discussion. I mean, like take a look at the lecture on theorizing. I think that will be very helpful to write the discussion. And then we only have one more chapter to write.